Hi everyone. Perfect.
Hi.
We just wrapped up the Karachi session. So everyone was taking a quick breather, and I know you came in a little bit early, so thank you for waiting. I promise it's worth it. I hope you came with lots of questions.
Yes.
Morning.
Morning.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
Yes, yes, yes. Elliot count. So I'm going to let Lee and Elliot introduce themselves, and then they'll speak a little bit. But to the extent that you have questions, just wave, and we want this to be a dialogue, so we can get. I let Lee and Elliot introduce themselves, and if you want to very briefly just point out who you are and what you do, I think that will be great.
Hi, I'm Lea Carpenter. I'm a writer. My writing career really started in 2008 with the death of my father. He had served in the American military, and after he died, I wanted to understand a little bit about how our military, and in particular our special operations forces, works and what the history of that community had been. So I wrote a novel, which was the story of a mother whose son goes missing in Afghanistan. But the idea was to, through the eyes of this young mother, tell the story of our American military. And after that book came out, did all right, I decided to look into a sort of connected organization, which was the Central Intelligence Agency and our intelligence services. And in both cases, I really just set out to talk to people and to try and understand. I am not an investigative journalist. I was not out to expose any tradecraft secrets or classified information. I really wanted to understand the experience of people who, since 2001, had served in these communities, which tend to be closed off from the larger civilian population, and to do that through the lens of emotion. I say my first book was really about a mother and a son. My second book was really about a father and a daughter. But I tried to use those relationships that anyone can understand to look at communities which are a little bit more closed. I've also written short fiction, and I wrote my first screenplay last year, which was also about a division of the CIA.
You should mention the film.
The film was called Mile 22, and I was hired by an American film director and writer called Peter Berg, who had made a movie called Lone Survivor. That movie, because in order to research that movie, he had spent a lot of time in the Navy SEAL community. He and I had gotten to know each other, and we have since then formed a friendship and a collaboration, and I hope that is the first of several things that we'll do together. But what we were interested in, what he was interested in, was really understanding, as I was, the emotional temperament of people who go into these lines of work, and their background might be lead them to make the choice to go into those lines of work.
Hi, so I am Elliot Ackerman, and I, for many years, was a U.S. Marine. I fought in our wars in Iraq. I fought in our wars in Afghanistan. But I always sort of thought I might wind up as a writer at the end of it. My mother was a novelist. And so after about 8 years in the Marines, I decided I was going to move into a new line of work. And I am now a novelist and a journalist. So my novels, I've written a novel about Afghanistan. I have written, my second novel was set on the Turkish-Syrian border and dealt with many of the themes around the Syrian Revolution, Arab Spring. And then my third novel, which was out this year, was my first that was actually set in the U.S. And it was about a marriage in the U.S., but one of the people in the marriage was an American service member. And then I have a first book of nonfiction that comes out this year, which is a bunch of my journalism put together. So Lee and I have written on many of the same topics, and I think we tend to write books that are more international in focus, but always at the core of our books are these very personal and relationship-based narratives. I won't speak for Lee, I'll speak for myself, because I think that the way all of us are able to gain entry into circumstances and situations that, at least for many Americans, seem very foreign to them, is through relationships and through characters, and through people who, although they might superficially seem very different from us, we start to realize all the ways that we're very, very similar. And so finding those intersections, places where we are all the same, is what interests me in my work, whether it's in journalism or fiction. So that's what I do.
Would you like to go around the room very quickly and tell us what your studies are or what you're doing?
Sure. Hi, my name is Safa. I recently graduated from Oxford, where I did a history degree. I've loved writing my whole life, and after graduating, I've been doing a journalism internship. And I've also recently started writing fiction again in my spare time.
Wonderful.
Hi, I'm Greta. I graduated from Northwestern University last year. Got my degree in journalism. Got my degree in journalism. Came back to Pakistan last year. Worked here for a while as a journalist and a graphic designer. Really struggled because, am I allowed to share? I really struggled because in the journalism industry here, we don't get paid for months. I left 4 months ago, and I still haven't been paid for 2 months, and they're never gonna pay me. So really struggled because I really love print journalism, and that's what I really wanted to do. But now I've realized I need to move to TV because that's not something that's going to sustain me. I'd love to continue doing print, but it's not sustainable here, at least. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nasir Siddiki. I am an anthropologist and I'm also a writer. I wouldn't say I'm a journalist because, as my young friend here said, you don't get paid in journalism in Pakistan. So if you want to be a journalist, you should have another occupation which pays you so that you can, do your work that way. So I basically research culture, history, politics in the region, and I write about it, and that's about it.
Wonderful.
My name is Mohiba Ackerman, and I have recently graduated from the Government College University, Lahore, and with a degree in English literature. And I am also a social activist and a feminist activist, working currently with many organizations and doing work on the ground.
Wonderful.
My name is Hassan Ijaz. I am currently studying in GC University for a degree of political science, BBA honors political science, and I am a debater as well.
Wonderful.
My name is Abdullah Mohsen. I am studying English literature from Government College University, Lahore. Other than studies, we do debates all over the country and represent our institution in various universities and colleges on national levels.
Hi, my name is Haris. I am a student of English literature at Government College University, Lahore, and my area of interest is post-colonial trade and post-colonial studies.
Post-colonial studies? Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful. So I think to set this off, perhaps I was originally going to ask Lea and Elliot about their writing process and the mechanics of that, but perhaps we'll come to that after we talk about some journalism and what journalism is. And I know that's more Elliot's department, but I'd love give them a sense of what it's like here. And so, because we've obviously heard some grievances there.
Well, I will tell people who, I consider myself young, but I guess I'm not that young anymore. But I feel it's sort of like it's a golden age and a dark age of journalism. So I'll start with why it's a dark age. It's a dark age because the journalism jobs that we like to think of, where you would get hired to be the, the Chicago Tribune's bureau chief in Lahore, like those jobs don't exist anymore. They just don't. And that makes it very, very difficult. There are very few of them. There's maybe like the New York Times bureau chief in Lahore. the bureau chief, and I used to live in Istanbul, and the bureau chief there was a friend of mine, and he had a great gig, but he was like one of 2 bureau chiefs there. So those jobs don't exist anymore. So that's sort of why it's a dark age, because the economics have stopped making sense in the traditional model, because there's so much content out there. So that's the bad news. I think the good news is that it's a golden age because these places don't have their bureaus. The barriers to entry now are very, very low. So if you have some talent, if you're a young person and you can go to a place and say, I'm just going to go here, I'm going to sleep on somebody's couch, and I'm going to start telling stories, you'd actually be really surprised how open, at least, a lot of Western news organizations that you might think, oh, I could never write for, pick whatever the New Yorker or the Atlantic Magazine or the Sunday Telegraph. You actually can. Because if you call them and say, I am here, and you show them that you can write, they'll say, well, we don't have anyone there because we can't afford to send somebody there. And this person seems very capable, and then you build a little bit of a relationship. You can go quite far, quite quickly. And I can point to several writers I know who now have very promising or successful journalistic careers, and they got their start by just crash landing in a place and saying, I'm here, I'm going to start writing about this place, and they got traction doing so. So, yes.
That's actually what one of my professors, that's what he keeps on telling me to do. He tells me, I have to write about Pakistan for the world, to, take back Pakistan's narrative, and, people would, international news organizations would be willing to pay for that because they don't really have anyone covering Pakistan that way. So that's one thing.
I agree with that. And I think it's sort of one of those things too, when you're young, I think the expectation that you're going to get your degree, that's a journalism degree, go to a newspaper, hand them your resume with your, I'm sure, stellar academic career and your winning interview that you do, and then they're going to give you a job that pays well with healthcare, and then you're going to go to the place and tell them, it doesn't work that way anymore. So what you sort of have to do is go out on your own, break out on your own, say, I'm going to take this time and I'm going to invest in doing this, and you're going to be filing dispatches and sending your stuff to places. Those places aren't going to be paying you anything. They'll pay you, maybe they pay you $100, $250 for a story that's 1,000 words, and you'll do that for a little while, and then you have to do it for a little while, but then you will get to a point where you get brought in, and then, and that's how you get one of those jobs. That is a good job. I mean, an example I love is there's a writer named Ben Taub. I don't know if you've ever seen his work. He's a staff writer at the New Yorker now. He's young, he's probably 30 or something, or early 30s. But I was working in southern Turkey and Syria, and he popped up around the same time as a Princeton graduate. His story is, when he was younger, came from a very musical family and went on the TV show The Voice. You'll know this show? Yeah. It's like America's, Got Talent, or American Idol. It's one of those singing shows. Went on The Voice, did well, made it to whatever round. He didn't win, but got a bunch of prize money. And then he took his prize money and went to South Turkey and Syria and started writing. And then his writing was very, he kind of filed enough and did enough interesting stories that the New Yorker hired him on, worked for them full time. That's his beat. So I would just say, for those of you who are doing journalism, you actually, if you want to write for the rest of the world or English-speaking newspapers that aren't based in Pakistan, you actually have a huge advantage, which is where you're sitting. That were we sitting here, and if we were in a classroom in Northwestern having this conversation, I would say, well, this is what you have to do, but you got to go buy a plane ticket and figure out how to have a life in a country that people need to know about. And you're already halfway there. So I think that's the good news. But it's different, and I would say that, although we all wish we could just sort of set up and get one of those gigs and be like my friend, the bureau chief in Istanbul, it's tough. You're going to have to make an investment in yourself first, and but that can bear fruit.
I was just this morning we were talking about Imran Khan, and I was thinking, it's amazing. I have not seen a major profile in an American publication of Imran Khan.
Yeah, you have not.
No,
we haven't seen.
I don't know if it's coming,
year, yeah.
where it's coming, but it's pretty astonishing that we have not had that here.
Yeah. And you can't underestimate, too, in the U.S., how little there is of people who are. When I was in southern Turkey reaching out to places like, hey, I'm going to go, there would be a battle going on across the border in Syria that every single news organization around was covering. It was the event that was going on. Everybody knew this was happening. And then you'd reach back to the U.S., and people were like, we didn't realize that's happening. That sounds pretty interesting. Do you think you can get there? Like, yeah, I can get there. It was like, great. Well, if you give us 1,000 words, we'd love it. And so I say that to you because I think when you're in a place, it feels like you're not experiencing anything special. But when you reach outside of your bubble into another, you actually realize that you have something that there's a demand for. But don't get frustrated. There's lots, and for any of you who are writing fiction too, it's rejection, 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 rejection. It doesn't matter how many times you get rejected. It just matters how many times you get the thumbs up. Okay, yes, we want this. We want to take it. So Lea and I talk. We call it our I have a baseball analogy I use for it, but I call it your up at bats. You have to get up, and you have to get up to bat to swing each time. And all that matters is you keep getting up to bat, because eventually you will hit, and you'll get your things out there.
I'm sure we can make that into a cricket analogy.
A cricket analogy. There you go.
It's close enough. It's close enough. But I really also, just because I think the beauty of both Lea and Elliott's work is that they've done such a fine job of taking, of straddling that line between fiction and non-fiction, using very real world events, experiences, your own experiences, and then writing both fiction as well as non-fiction. And I'd love for you to spend a little bit of time on that process of writing, both fiction, non-fiction, and sort of what your own process is for the students.
I remember when I was starting my first book, excuse me, I read an interview with a well-known writer here called Jeffrey Eugenides. And Jeffrey Eugenides said in the interview that he gets down to his desk at 9 a.m, and at 6 p.m. in the evening, he has to force himself to stop. And I called a friend of mine who I knew had the office next to Jeffrey Eugenides, and I said that I had just read this interview about how he works from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and it made me feel terrible about myself and insecure because I can't remember one day where I ever had that many hours to write. And I said, I want to know if it's true. Does he really work from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m.? And my friend, who's a poet, said, he does, but we're not really sure what he does after 11 a.m. And I like that story because I think that the creativity is not necessarily something that can happen 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. There's a lot that happens on the margins of the actual writing work, a lot of research, a lot of, in my case, wandering around the kitchen. But what I really, when I started, I had no process because I didn't know what I was doing. All I knew was that if I could write 1,000 words a day, however I got to that word count, that would be a kind of simple accomplishment that I felt that I could meet. And everything else that happened around that 1,000 words, maybe it's rewriting that 1,000 words later in the day, maybe it's rereading them and editing them, maybe it's setting out what the work is for the next day, but that would be enough. And some days I would write 1,000 words, some days I would write 3,500 words. But as long as I could just get the process down of doing a little bit of writing, on my days when I can write, that was the essence of the process. And I had read an interview with another writer who I admired who said, 1,000 words a day. Writing is like very mundane in the way that going to the gym is to exercise your arms. I think it's something that has to be done regularly, even on the days when you feel least like doing it. And when I feel out of touch with my work, it's when I haven't been producing that 1,000 words for a period of time. And even if I'm writing 1,000 words that are never going to make it into the finished product, I think that's really the way that I've found to structure my days as a writer, because the writing life, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, can be very unstructured, and that can be very, or I'll just speak for myself, that was for me very intimidating, having had at another point in my career a more highly structured job where I went into an office and I felt productive. I found the one hitting that 1,000 word mark was a simple way to feel like I had some structure to my days.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to what Lee says. I think anyone who were to look at me in the course of a day would sort of say, "Wow, you don't have any structure to your days. You wake up, you go here, you go to the restaurant, you do your work, you kind of futz around." Like, my days are highly structured, but they're highly structured in my own mind. That I know exactly what I have to accomplish that day to get to whatever the end is of a project. And I think for those of you who are interested in writing fiction in particular, fiction, when I'm working on a novel, it's like you're in a dream. And I have to every day be able to, and set conditions so I can re-enter the dream state I'm in for the book. So often for me, and again, as Lee said, they're very mundane things. I write 1,000 words a day too when I'm working on a novel, whether they're good or bad. And I also will make sure when I finish my work, I always stop when I know it's going to happen the next day. Because you can write yourself out. So I always stop by knowing, tomorrow this is what's going to happen. And I put some notes on the bottom of the page, and that allows me to begin again the next day. But there is, I think, for process, as much as we sometimes like to think of the writer or the artist sort of wandering around in a whimsy and waiting till this stroke of inspiration hits. I mean, there's some people who work that way and everyone's different, but most of the writers I know, there's not wandering around waiting for the whimsy. They're sitting at your desk, staring at your screen, and writing, no, that doesn't work. And then you finally start to get in process to what works. Yeah.
What about research? Research sources. In our previous conversation, we talked a little bit even about, books or publishing or access to books. And I think, for the students in Pakistan to understand sort of what research looks like for you here, what sources look like for you here, give them a little bit of context on how you yourself tend to work and what's out there.
Well, I would just make one other point, and it's sort of a research point, and again, this goes for people writing fiction and nonfiction. You have to read. Like, you have to be a reader if you're going to be, I mean, it's probably not a problem for you all if you're in school right now, but even leaving school, I spend almost as much time, if not, I actually spend more time reading than I spend writing, because often I'm reading my own work, so I'm editing it. So, but you have to read. You should not be afraid of reading something and saying, I love this book or what they did. I want to try to do something similar. Like, that's how you learn and how you develop, like, what your taste is and your style is for books or even in bits of journalism. And you try to have to figure out and see what another writer is doing. So it comes to research. So, I mean, there's research, but for me, a big part of my research is just reading, whether I'm trying to get facts or whether I'm also trying to, many of my best ideas will come to me while I'm reading something else. I don't know why. It sort of opens my mind. So maybe it's a part of research.
Reading is part of my research, but the primary piece of my research in both of the novels was talking to people, finding people who were living lives in the communities that I was interested in trying to portray. I spoke to as many people in the military as I could for the first book, as many people affiliated with or having prior affiliations with CIA as I could for the second book, because I felt like then in the creation of the characters, I could draw on people I had actually met in certain ways, although with fiction you're ultimately always drawing on yourself, your own experience. Characters will ultimately be reflections of experiences you've probably had. I felt it really helpful, particularly in looking at communities with highly technical languages, that I had to be around people using these acronyms or turns of phrase until I myself felt comfortable putting those acronyms and turns of phrase into the mouths of characters.
But how hard is it to go into an environment or into a space where you are the outsider and then you're learning that language? So both in terms of sort of that technical competence, but also, for example, in your case, writing about parts of the world that you have not been to. So what does it take to put yourself, I know in Pakistan, you know, we love our post-colonial literature. We love, there's certain experiences that are very easy to draw upon. What is it like both in terms of industry and then geography to force yourself or to write effectively about something you know very little about to begin?
I had been an editor and an editor of literary fiction before I wrote my first book. And I had read lots of stories about experiences, whether they were well written or poorly written, about experiences that I myself had less than zero interest in ever writing about. I didn't want to write about, you know, romance on a college campus. I didn't want to write about working as a waitress in downtown New York City. I didn't want to write about many, many experiences that people have written beautiful books about, but I wanted to use writing as a way to really try and learn about things where the barrier to my learning about them was pretty high. So, you know, I chose in the first instance something that was familiar only insofar as my father had served in the military. And I thought, wow, that's something I know nothing about. When I started the journey of learning about that book, I probably couldn't have told you really the difference between the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. And by the end of my experience in learning about that book, I felt that I knew that, you know, that I knew a lot about that. People say, I never took a fiction writing class, but there is that old adage, write what you know. And to which I would always respond, if my own life experiences had been extraordinary, exceptional, or interesting, I would write what I know. But I grew up in a pretty small town. I had a lot of internal emotional experiences that I thought were interesting, but I couldn't point to one experience I'd had in my life that I would ever want to write a novel about. So in my case, for my fiction, short fiction, and the book, and the novels, I really wanted to go outside my experience, and there is some risk in that. And the books may not have, my books did all right, but they may not have done all right, but the experience as a writer of really going outside what I knew was incredible. So I have lots of friends who are writers who write about what they know, and they do it so well. That was just not my choice. And so in order to write about what I didn't know, I had to do the research.
I have a question for Lee. Lee, I read an essay by you, and I think it was published in Time. It was about the time you spent with your father, and you went on a holiday. Yes, I read that. So, like, any of your novels, were they inspired by his life and what you found out about him after he passed away?
I think both of my books were in different ways.
The rest of them some context.
So my father and mother had a big age difference. My mother was much younger, and so my father actually served in World War II, and I was born when he was 56. So by the time I was old enough to talk with him about his life, I never would have said to him, you know, what did you do 40 years ago or 50 years ago? And it really wasn't until after he died that I got interested in his career in the military. And 2 days after he died, my mother and I were given a document about something that he'd been involved in, which I didn't know about, and it made me want to learn more about his military, and subsequent to that, more about the military in general. So the first book, 11 Days, really was probably, if someone were to psychoanalyze me, they would say that book was an attempt to get closer to my father, even though I structured the book as a mother-son story. And then my second book, Red, White, Blue, was really about a young woman whose father dies, and she's trying to figure out who he was. So in both books, there is that element of a central female character trying to understand something that's foreign to her.
I think for a Pakistani audience especially, it's probably interesting or worth knowing how difficult or hard it is to write about the military in.
Yeah. And how easy or difficult is it for you guys to reach out to, you know, let's say the military or the army or the secret services and ask for information or access to data? Is it possible at all? Because I wouldn't think it's possible in Pakistan.
You're going to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say it's because I reported in DC last year, and oh god, you guys like I got introduced with the FBI. Like it was so easy to connect with people there. So I was gonna say it's like because I reported in Qatar too, and my experience has throughout my life has been like it's not easy to report on things, but when I reported in DC, it was so much easier. Yeah. But you can share your experience.
Yeah,
Sure. I don't do specifically that type of like national security reporting per se, but I can imagine it's easier. I think if we're, if we're talking straight journalism, I think then it just depends on, if you're reaching out to whatever organization, whether they are or are not willing to talk to, that just depends on the country that you're in. I think there's this other idea, which is, well, how do you write about things that inevitably will feel very distant to you? And it's tough to write about something that feels far away. You have to bring it in so it feels close to you before you're even able to write about it. Why do we feel away? I think it's because like writing takes a certain amount of courage. It takes like amount of courage and guts and self-confidence to say, you know what, like I have something to say about this and it's worthy enough for me to be putting myself out there to say it. Oftentimes I think writers I know, whether they're writing in fiction or nonfiction, they will do all this research, and 90% of it they're never going to use, but they're doing it to wrap themselves in the subject so they feel comfortable. Okay, now I'm going to say something about the subject, and I think that's very, very worthy. There's also the trap one can get into, which is you need to wrap yourself in everything that you know, and then you need to forget it. Then you need to actually tell a story. And many people will try to just convey everything they know, and it's messy, and nobody cares everything that you know. They care that you can just tell them a story. And so when I say one needs to forget it, you need to then just focus on telling the story. And you can pull from the things that you've learned. I think it's very important not to allow yourself to become a slave to the research that you've done.
I think I have
sort of know what you're writing about.
Sorry, yeah, we have a question at the back.
Yeah.
So, considering that both of you have experience with both fiction and non-fiction, the question that I want to ask is that sometimes what happens is that, like you said, that you think of fiction as a dream-like state. So you have to be like in that dream to write fiction. But when you, when you talk about non-fiction and when you delve a lot into theory, and that's a state where you're very much awake. So does that become a hindrance in the process of writing fiction? Because when you're awake and very much aware, then you do not want to go back to sleep again, or don't want to willingly suspend that disbelief that you have with fiction. So that is something that I personally felt became a hindrance in writing fiction, that when you're doing a lot of research, when you're reading a lot of non-fiction, what happens is that it becomes a hindrance in writing fiction. So have you ever had to deal with that?
Not really, because I bristle at the distinction between fiction and nonfiction, because I think in all writing, what you're trying to do is reveal the truth of an experience. And so I give myself a lot of license to, particularly when I'm starting on a project, if it's a work, and particularly if it's a work of fiction, to just kind of throw all the fiction, nonfiction away, those distinctions. And, I'm not only writing what happened, but I'm writing what should have happened or what could have happened. So to give you an example of that, my second book, which is all set around the Syrian civil war, and most of it's set in southern Turkey, but there are parts of it that are in Syria. The genesis of the book was I was traveling in and out of South Turkey, and one day down to the border crossing in a little town called Kilis. And there was a bunch of fighting across the border that day. I got down there with a couple of friends, and And anyways, we had this trip that day, and we met some people who'd been engaged with the fighting. But I came back to the US probably 3 or 4 weeks later, and I was sitting actually in the living room of a mutual friend of ours, and he was like, "Well, how was your trip?" And we were in Texas of all places. I was sort of talking to him about it. He was like, "Man," he's like, "That's amazing. You should write about that." I was like, "Well, it's not really a piece of journalism. Like, what journal? I mean, I went to the border, and that's not a good piece of journalism. I don't know. But you should just write it." And I was at that time, I was like, I am going to try to write a novel about this, but I didn't know my point of entry. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to write what happened that day down at the border. And I started writing the story, and I was like, well, I'm not going to be the guy who's going down. It's going to be someone else. And I made a protagonist, and I basically described everything that happened that day. That became the opening of a novel. Because at a certain point, I was describing that day, and then I hit the end of my facts. I was like, this could have happened. And this could have happened. And then I just wound up, and then it opened up a whole novel. And that's often what will happen for me in fiction, is like the nonfiction will be sort of the seed for a whole, work of fiction that sprouts from it. But if I'm writing nonfiction, I'm doing a piece of journalism, I'm walking around, I'm having experiences, I'm speaking to people, I'm taking my notes, but it's almost like I'm just a vacuum. I'm sucking in everything that I'm seeing. And even before I even sit down to write, it's almost like I'm a filmmaker and I'm cutting scenes in my mind. I'm like, okay, so this is going to be, someone did this and there's this image, and that's going to be the opening of this piece, I think. Okay, I talked to that, he said this thing over there, okay, that's going to go in, and then, this person said this. And so I'm just gathering it all together in my notebook. But in my mind, I'm already kind of laying it out, because I know I have to tell a story. So I try not to be, I really don't feel like, always at the center of it is you're trying to tell a story, and the facts for nonfiction, they're only relevant as they serve what is the story, the piece you're trying to convey.
Follow-up question. So the thing is that both the writings that you've done, even in fiction, so they have been inspired by political events. So would you say that you tried to make a political statement out of the fiction that you were writing? Were you conscious when you were doing that, or it was just a process that you were going through and you were not aware of it, not consciously doing it?
Also, no, I am never trying to make a political statement when I'm writing, because I think if you're trying to tell people what they're supposed to think, people don't like that. It doesn't work. You know what I mean? I don't like, the reading I do, if somebody tries to give me a book where they're hammering home a political message, I don't like that. I roll my eyes. I'm not going to read that. What I want is someone to tell me a story, where the characters and what's happening are real, and I become emotionally invested, and then I walk out and I'm asking myself questions. And I think great fiction and great storytelling, leaves you asking yourself questions, and that can then be political. I'm not saying their political writing isn't worth anything, but novels that work the best way, leave people asking themselves. I'm sure you've all had this experience, where you walk out of a film or you finish a book and you shut it and you can't stop thinking about it because there are all these lingering questions, because it's made you look at something differently. But if you as the creator are not framing through a story these questions that are challenging your reader, if instead you're cramming answers down their throats, it's not going to make for a very good piece of art. So I think the best storytelling elegantly sets up situations, sets up characters, and does it in a way that the reader is invited into this world, and it's a world in which they're probed to start asking themselves questions about what they're seeing.
I think, Elliot, though, it's very interesting, and I'd love Lee's perspective on this, but some of what I think Elliot is also talking about is this idea of what being a critical thinker then means and how it informs your writing. And there are many things, I think, I know sort of your education and your background, but I think there are parts to your becoming a writer, that critical thinking which, within the education systems you two have been so wonderfully a part of, have led to your writing. So you have to also, how do people, or how do students of writing, or how do students of literature or journalism incorporate that in their life, where it's not a given that critical thinking was a skill that was rise within our education system, if that makes sense, right? Like those questions that you're asking, both in character development, both in terms of making statements, how do you become a better critical thinker and therefore allow that to inform your writing?
There's, I want to address that question of whether or not I'm trying to make a political statement in my own work, but there's a big overarching philosophy in higher education in America, which has always been the thought process is as important as the answer or the solution. Mariam and I were in grad school together, and I struggled to show my thought process elegantly when solving math problems because I was prone to get the wrong answer at the end. But I thought as long as I carefully and beautifully laid out the questions I was asking, that would be enough. And it actually often was. And I think the same is true when you're trying to answer other kinds of questions. In my own work, I'll just take the example of my first book, 11 Days. I was trying to look at this community which when I started the book was not well known. When I finished the book was very well known, which was our Navy SEAL team community. And there's a beautiful W.H. Auden poem about a Bruegel painting. And in the Bruegel painting, as Auden points out, there are very, very bad things happening in the background, like people are dying and falling out of the sky. But in the foreground of the painting, a farmer tills his land and children are playing with animals. And the analysis that the poet makes of the painting is that ordinary life always continues, even up against the backdrop of incredibly cataclysmic events. And so in my first novel, 11 Days, we had this event, which was the raid that killed Osama Bin Laden in Pakistan. But I wanted to tell the story of a mother and what goes on in her emotional life over the course of the days in the wake of that raid. And so the book was not meant to be political, nor was it meant to make a political statement. It was really meant to, just as that Auden poem looking at the Bruegel painting had done, say that horrible, incredibly complex events are going on the national security or global level, but in a small town in America, a mother's child has gone missing, and I want to tell her story, knowing that these other things are happening in the background. I don't know if I did it successfully, but that was the goal of that book, which is to say that we're all trying to get through our days at the same time as being aware of these things that are going on globally.
I think to what Lea was saying and your comment, when you all write your books, what you will see is one of the real pleasures is you'll write the book and it will go out into the world and people will read it. And then, I've had many things where I've done a reading or presented the book somewhere and someone will come up to me who's read the book and they'll say, your book was about this and it did make this point, and why did you write this? Because this is what it was about. And I'll be thinking, that's not what the book was about in my mind, but it will very much be what that book was about in their mind. And their response to the book is as real as my thoughts about that book. So it's, people will take their own experiences and they will project them onto a book. And that's one of the wonderful things that they do. So it's tough to make one statement because people are going to append all of their own experiences onto whatever piece of art they are experiencing.
Are there more questions?
Yeah, so we've been talking about fiction and non-fiction so far, but I wanted to ask you a bit about, Lea mentioned that you also wrote a screenplay, Mile 22, and I wanted to ask you a bit more about that and how that process was maybe different from you, or what was the same about, that and writing a novel.
The primary difference in my admittedly limited experience is that when you are writing a novel, I think the same is largely true of a piece of journalism. While you're writing it, you are the CEO and completely benign dictator of the project. You make all the choices, all the voices are coming from your own head. You're putting the pieces together in a certain way. When you were, as I was, writing a screenplay that had essentially been commissioned by a studio, you have on any given day between 2 and 25 people yelling at you, telling you what to do, telling you how to think, telling you what words to put in the mouths of characters. So it's a much more collaborative process, at least when it gets to the editing stage. And I welcomed that even when people had a different point of view to mine, because it was less lonely, frankly. Writing can be very lonely. And with a book, you do enter into a relationship with an editor, which hopefully is a great relationship. But in the film and television world, the process is much more collaborative. It's also much more technical. You have a certain page count you need to hit because of the number of minutes that either the television show or the film has to be. If you're writing for our broadcast networks, you have to take into account the commercial breaks, and it really it's a much more scientific process, and you're much more limited. You also have, of course, the end product is less writer controlled and more director and actor controlled. So you have to know that whatever words you put down on the page will ultimately have brought to life by an actor, which is exciting in some ways, and then also limiting in other ways if you're used to, again, really having control of your characters. So
Well, there's a famous line from the writer Joan Didion, who I don't know if you all are familiar with her work, but she said she wrote a lot for film. It was, when I'm writing for film, it's like I'm taking notes for the director.
Tell us a little bit about characters. How hard or easy is it to develop characters, especially with experiences that are... I know you find yourself in it, and even in your writing, I love looking for threads of your voice in there. But how hard or difficult is it to develop characters, both good and bad? How easy is it or difficult to put yourself in someone else's shoes?
I mean, I think I don't know if it's easy or difficult isn't how I would think of it. I think it's like if the whole point of writing is to imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes. And that's the joy in it in many ways. But oftentimes when I'm writing, I think if you have like an associative mind where you're always looking at other things saying this is like this and this is like that, it helps as a writer, because when I have a character I'm writing who might experientially seem very, very different from me, and I'm trying to imagine my way into their shoes, I will think about what they're going through, what their challenges are, their experiences are, then I'll be thinking of my own experiences. I'll be thinking, well, they're wrestling with this issue, and maybe it would make them feel this specific way. The way they feel might be sort of how I felt that one time, and once I hit them, like, yeah, that's sort of what that would feel like. And then like, okay, I got it. Like, I understand this character and why they feel this way. So I refer to kind of like as the well I'm drawing from. I have to figure out what well I'm going to draw from of my own experience, of my own things that feel close to me, so I can give this character life. And so I think the joy in it is when you are able to tap into something that feels real, and like, this is who that person is, this is why they feel that way, and I get them because of this thing that I've been through. So I really like that.
I think we have a question from Madden. I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask a question. I think all of you will agree that we cannot always say that fiction is completely isolated from history. I mean, fiction does contain important historical reference points which enable us to, understand that particular society or understand that particular time. So when you write about, when your stories are situated in areas like Iraq, in Afghanistan, or Syria for that matter, don't you think it somehow is going to, make political opinions? The people who are going to read it, they are somehow going to take some political influences from what you are going to write. And when you know that they are going to take it, and when, especially in the past, when the writers from the West, particularly those who were writing at the time of colonialism, they did make opinions of the people, in the West. So don't you think people like Joseph Conrad, writing Heart of Darkness, which has a particular representation of the Africans, so don't you think because of the fact that somehow you are going to make a political opinion, or you are going to affect people politically, it does put an extra responsibility on you when you write about such topics, and especially when your stories are situated in areas like Iraq and Pakistan?
That's such a great question, and of course it's completely true. I do think that, back to what Elliot said about encountering readers and experiences of your work, which were not experiences that you yourself intended, or that they read the work. It's just how the process works, which is what makes it so strange and magical, that the reader always is coming with their own unique set of experiences to the story, and will read the story through that lens. So based on the year in which you were born and where you've been in your life, you will have a different experience of Heart of Darkness to someone who's had a different upbringing, coming from a different place. All I can say of my own work is that I really tried to tell stories of true emotional experiences, and to the extent that they bump up against geographic regions or historical episodes, that's wallpaper. That's not the center of what I'm trying to look at. There may be ways to heighten emotional experience beyond what I myself have known, but I think if you set out to write something that's overtly political, God bless you, because it's really difficult to know how anything will be received, again, by anyone who's got a different political viewpoint or a different life experience. For me, what I felt fully confident in writing about was the experience of being a mother, the experience of knowing I would die for my child, the experience of being a daughter, the experience of knowing the unbearable grief of losing a parent. I can step up and talk about those experiences because I've had them. Would I ever be able to as confidently say that I could speak about the experience of, say, something you had been through? No. And writers who are able to do that, if you go back to Shakespeare, for example, not that he's the be-all end-all, but take anyone you like from 400 years ago, from any culture, and you look at the expansiveness of some of those writers and their willingness to write with certainty about universal themes and cross-border relationships, and we should take a piece of their confidence when we try and write, because I think the socio-political climate internationally now is very fraught, and people are increasingly afraid of writing outside of their own experience, and I'm not sure that's a good thing.
I think we can probably all agree that at this moment there are no shortage of voices that are all telling us the many, many ways as humans we are different, and intractably different, in ways that we can never understand one another. And what interests me, and I would say is probably a theme that unites all of my work, is this is pushing back against those ideas and saying there might be ways that we are different, but there are many, many, many more ways that we are the same, and trying to tell stories that find those commonalities in kind of unexpected places. So, my first book, a novel called Green on Blue, is all set in Paktika province in Afghanistan. It's a novel told in the first person, and the narrator is a young Afghan named Aziz. So I am Aziz in this book. And so you might say, wow, that seems very bold, Elliot. You're a white American guy, and you're pretending to be an Afghan in Paktika province writing a novel about that. Geez, like that seems like you and Joseph Conrad would be best buddies. And my assertion in that book, that I spent my entire youth in my 20s when I was your age fighting in Paktika province. That was the defining event of my life. And furthermore, when I was there, I worked as an advisor to Afghan troops. So it was usually me and 3 to 5 Americans with about 400 Afghans. So for me, the war I went through, all of my war buddies, the guys I fought, they were all Afghans. And so when I came back, I said, I want to tell our story and my story, but it was this story that was all of us in Paktika province. And so that story, ultimately, the narrative arc of the story is the story of this Afghan Aziz, and he murders an American. and it's all told from his perspective of why he murders this American at the end of the book. To sort of flash forward, I told this story before, when I was working as a journalist, I have a book of nonfiction that comes out. And one of the strands in this book of nonfiction is a meeting I had with a fellow named Abu Hassar in southern Turkey. So I started traveling to southern Turkey with an American friend of mine who started an NGO. And he had an office and a place to stay, and so I was staying with him. And one of his colleagues was a Syrian man named Abed. And Abed was from Damascus, had been very, used to work at the British consulate, very, very well educated, speaks perfect English. And he was working for my friend, Matt was his name, and he shows up one day at our house. I'm cooking dinner that night, and he had been out in the field that day in a refugee camp in a town called Ackerman. And I said, Abed comes in, it's 9 at night, and I say, oh, Abed, how was your day? He says, oh, Elliot, he's like, I had a very interesting day today. I met somebody who I think you should meet. I said, okay, well, who's the guy that I should meet? Oh, well, his name is Abu Hassar, and he fought for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but I think the two of you would really get along. So I had fought as a Marine against Al-Qaeda in Al-Anbar province when I was 24 years old. I said, oh, okay, well, let's go meet him. I went down to a chocolate with Abed the next day. I sat down with Abu Hassar, the two of us, and it was this idea of two veterans of the Iraq War would sit down and talk, but we fought on different sides. What would we talk about? So Abed was sitting next to me, and he was translating because I don't speak fluent Arabic. And Abu Hassar and I started talking, and it turned into about a 4-hour conversation. Us each being very curious about the other. And that was sort of my bet. When I went down to meet with him, my bet was, this guy's not going to hate me. He actually, because we're now in our 30s now, we're all older, we both have children, we're actually going to be very curious about one another, because the defining events of our life was the war we fought in. And that war, it was like a shadow dance, right? Where you're dancing with someone you can't see. Your dance partner is someone you never see. And when you do that shadow dance for years and years and years and years, at the end, you want to see your partner. And so we sat down, we talked about everything, but there was a moment in our conversation, everyone's smoking cigarettes, drinking tea, 4 hours into it. My friend Abed, who's been translating the whole time, is tired. He says, I have to go to the bathroom, and he leaves. As intensely as Abu Hassar and I had been talking, suddenly now it's very awkward, and we're like two 13-year-olds on their first date. We're sort of you can't talk to me. And there was my notebook was between us. And so he took my notebook, and there was a line in it, which was the border between Syria and Iraq. And he goes and in one of the little towns, he writes down the name of a town, and he writes a number next to it. And then he hands me the pencil. I'm like, what does he want me to do? I'm like, oh, I get it. And then I write a number next to his number. He writes down another name of a village and a number, and then I write a number next to his number. And our hands are kind of chasing each other around the page as we do this, just like we once chased each other around Iraq. And what he was doing was he was writing the names of villages and towns and the date he had been there. And then he wanted me to write the date that I had been there. And we were trying to see if we'd been at the same place at the same time to know if we'd ever fought against one another. And that was a language that not even Abed, who was translating us, because he hadn't fought in Iraq, could translate. It was a language only he and I shared. And so I believe in those languages. I think they exist. I am trying to tell stories that assert that, yes, they do exist. And I think those stories are the only things that can stop all of these people, this deluge of voices that's always telling us how we are different and that we can never understand each other. And I think that is the only thing you can do. It's the only way you can have peace. It's the only way you can come home. It's the only way we can assert that we are all humans. When we hear certain stories, we all feel the same.
Actually, I want to ask that when you write a novel, you know that there could be parallel stories going on in novel about the same society. And particularly when you have been through those societies, when you have gone there, and you know that these stories are from the real world experiences, and these scenarios are happening in the real world. Then when these instances, when these parallel stories collide with each other, do you know that the changes that are taking place in some society about which you are writing, are you consciously writing about certain predictions that this could have happened, this should have happened, and this should happen in the future? Is it a prediction of the future, or you leave it completely to the audience, to the readers, that they might predict this, the realities of the society according to their own imagination? Or do you write isolated instances like a woman who has lost her son? Are these isolated episodes, or you write these as the predictions that would take in that civil society like America, Iran, Afghanistan, which are real societies? So are these predictions or just these isolated stories?
So is the question, are you trying to project out what will happen?
And from the lens of, is it a simple social commentary, or is there a direction you're taking the reader in? And I think this is very closely tied again to this idea of your perspective and what you're projecting on a situation. So what I think he's talking about are the nuanced social norms in these societies, and sort of your observations. Are you simply, whether it is the mother loving her child or the way that relationship unfolds, or are you predicting certain things, the evolution of society?
In my case, I think I was not trying to consciously predict anything. I'm mainly trying to show the emotional life of a person encountering an extreme situation.
No particular themes. I think it's very thematic, especially when you start. I mean, for example, in Pakistan, there was just yesterday or day before, there was a bill passed banning child marriage. And so there are directions that society moves. I think we see it more obviously. I think in that part of the world, those things are less reported here. They've been going on for so long that some of these things, society has changed more organically, or at least, we don't see that. So more along the social context.
I don't feel in any of my writing I'm trying to write a book that advocates for a position, if that makes sense. Now, I'm not in a novel trying to tell a story that tells the reader this is what should happen in the future, that we should adopt this policy or that policy. If I want to write something like that, I'll do an opinion piece and try to get it submitted into a newspaper. And I do some writing like that. In a novel, I feel like I'm trying to tell a story that's compelling to a reader, and I'm trying to set up situations that leave a reader asking complex questions that try to show every vantage point on an issue that's possible, so the reader walks away. If a reader walks away knowing exactly what they think, then I haven't done my job as a writer. I think a reader should walk away from a book, or when I'm reading, the books I enjoy reading are the ones where I walk away and I'm thinking about everything that happened to the characters in the book, and I'm not really sure what I think. I'm not sure what was right or what was wrong, and I see all the complexity of what those characters were dealing with. So that's what I enjoy reading and what I hope to write.
So, what are some of the recent books that you read by other authors that have really inspired you, both of you? Any opinion pieces or essays or any fiction that you read recently that was, really inspired you and you want to get back to writing your own thing after reading that? Anything of that sort?
I have read 3 incredible books in succession, which is unusual, but I feel like I had a great reading winter. And they're actually all 3 nonfiction books, but I can talk about fiction too. The first is a book called Say Nothing by an American journalist called Patrick Radden Keefe, and it's really the story of the history of the IRA in Northern Ireland, told through the stories of 2 women, one a young female paramilitary officer in the IRA, and the other a young single mother of 10 children who goes missing. And I myself did not have any deep desire to understand Ireland, but this book tells such a riveting story of what was essentially a war zone for a long time. So it is also a war story. I'm always interested in those. And I recommend that. Second is a book by the writer George Packer a journalist here who writes for The New Yorker, and the title of the book is Our Man, and it is nominally a biography of Richard Holbrooke. I'm sure you all know who he is, our diplomat who had been our special envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it's really the story of his life. But in telling the story of his life, it's really a story of the end of a certain kind of diplomat in American history. And really, it tells the story of a generation of young Foreign Service officers who went to Vietnam in their 20s and had a dream of affecting a certain kind of diplomacy and what happened to that dream. And the third is a book called Three Women, which is coming out this summer, which is the story of the lives of three American women, which this journalist spent 10 years writing, and it's just an incredible piece of nonfiction. I also must say that the best book I think that's coming out this year, although I'm slightly biased, is coming out in June, and that's Elliott's book of nonfiction. It is a heartbreaking, unbelievably beautiful collection of essays about his experiences, and I think that is really a must read. But now, as I'm sort of in a period where I'm doing some writing in another medium, which is television, I'm trying to think about what the next book will be. I've actually been reading primarily nonfiction. It's funny, and Elliot reads primarily fiction.
Yeah.
Do you?
What I've read, I try to read very widely and disassociatively, so that puts me into, sending me into topics I never would have gone into. I read a great book, a novel called Turbulence by a writer named Daniel Saloy. He also wrote a book called All That Man Is, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize a couple of years ago at lead recommendation. And then my one big reading project, if we talk about political books and controversial books, is in the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s, a writer named Shelby Foote wrote. He was a novelist, but he got commissioned to write what became the definitive history of the U.S. Civil War, and it's one of the great reading challenges. It's called The Civil War, and it's 3 1,000-page volumes, so 3,000 pages on the Civil War. And I'd always known that it was one of the great reading challenges to have said, I've read Shelby Foote's The Civil War, but I know I can never do it. But it came out on Audible, so I've been since January. I made my New Year's resolution to listen to the entire Civil War, and I'm about halfway through it. It's a really immersive experience. But you, even reading it now and knowing, or even listening to it now and understanding the U.S. Civil War, you see how the way he tells it in the 70s and 80s is different than how people might think about it now or want to remember it now. And so you can really see the evolution of a story and how he tells that history. Yeah, so that's why.
And Elliot, you're talking to an audience where, because history has been, or the way history has been taught to us has been, just around 70 years. Yeah. To compare that, or the parallel of what you're seeing, whether it is, the Civil War, whether it is, I'm sure you've all seen or heard or read about what Hamilton was, the musical and the performance. But what is so interesting is when you take that lens and you recognize these experiences or sort of their voices in the context of really it's only been those 70 odd years, what that means as well. So your experiences and your perspective is so helpful, just because I think all of you are so lucky to be able to be so influential in this change that's happening. I just want to take a minute and make sure if there are any last questions before we wrap up.
Yeah. I have a comment. I don't have a question.
I think we'll start with Mohimba.
So I would just want to ask a little bit more about the character development process. So like you guys have also developed characters who have had who have been in different power dynamics. For example, like you said that as a woman like writing about men, or like developing a character that's a man who is in a completely different power structure. And when you talk about developing characters from the East or the Middle East, who are of course have been historically underprivileged, when we talk about the comparison of the West and East. And so how do you develop characters who have had this sort of structural who are structurally different and belong to these different power dynamics? So how do you develop characters like that? So being a woman, developing a character as a man. So how does that?
Empathy, imagination. You imagine and you empathize, and I think we can all feel. I mean, my worldview is that we can. Doesn't matter what your power structure is or dynamic, or we are all fundamentally human beings, and because of that, we have more in common with one another than we have that are different, and we can use our innate empathy to whatever differences to leap over those differences and really imagine our way into other people's shoes. I think that is the job of the writer. So you use empathy, and there's some people who do it well, and there's some people who do it less well. And if you're a good writer, you'll do it well and you'll do it credibly. But the way you do it is by empathizing and researching and really understanding. I mean, that word author comes from the word authority, and you get your authority by really understanding what you're writing about.
I agree.
I would like to ask this question that I understand that, like what you said earlier, that you write about common emotions or common feelings or all those things, but this somehow, as your story or as your it is situated within a particular real world context. So my question is that both of you would recognize that a lot of people, in fact the majority of people in Asia or Africa, have strong resentment against the imperial powers, against America, for fighting wars like Iraq and Afghanistan. So when you write about these stories, when you write about these stories, and especially when you have been associated with these operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, so why would the audience in Asia or in Afghanistan be interested to read your work when they feel that you have been associated with the imperial project, and you have not clearly stated that whether it is right or wrong, to all those things. So why would a reader in Afghanistan or Syria or in Pakistan be compelled to read your work?
I would say, why would someone who fought against me, I mean, in combat, we were trying to kill each other in our 20s, want to sit down with me in our 30s and share a cup of tea and talk for 3 hours and actually and become my friend. We're still friends with one another. Because at the end of the day, I mean, we have choices. We can either live our lives bemoaning how we're all different and live our lives aggrieved, and I think it's exhausting. I don't want to live my life that way. Or we can be open to the idea of reconciling with one another and saying, and I think that's what good fiction does. It acknowledges all of the many points of view that exist around an issue. And it doesn't force anyone to concede anything. It forces everyone to just acknowledge. And that is always a two-way street. So, if you read my books, I mean, my first book is about an Afghan who murders an American. So there's plenty in that book about all of the ways America is horrible. If you read it, plenty of that acknowledgement. And there's also scenes of the Americans' point of view. But I think reconciliation only comes from everybody acknowledging their varied points of view. They don't have to agree with one another. Like Abu Asar and I spent half our conversation with him telling me about, the coming of the Mahdi and the end of days battle that will occur at Dabiq. And I'm sort of like, okay, I don't believe that, but we can still be friends. And so I think ultimately that's what all art does. And the alternative, which is that we all just believe that we have to go into our various camps and hate one another. I don't want to live like that. And I think that it's a pessimistic and cynical worldview. And so I think I hope there are enough people in the world who don't have that cynicism, who are sort of reaching out. And in my work, I'm trying to reach towards them too.
So mine's more from Elliot. I want to know a little bit more about how you started your journalism career. Were you living overseas and reporting for American papers? And also, similar, I want to ask, how do you mentioned like, you just like go, because what I really want to do is I want to be in Pakistan writing for international papers, but I can't just like go sit on their couch and be like, no, I want to write for you. This is my work, and like look at my work. Because like you can't just send an email to their HR or like to their managing editor, because they receive so many emails, they're probably not going to read your email. So like what I found helpful is like reaching out to professors and asking them to connect me with someone or some paper, or I just like try to connect with people on LinkedIn, and like when like somebody accepts my request, I'm like, hey, this is what I'm working on, would you be interested? How do I connect with people from international papers if what I want to do is like be reporting from Pakistan, but for international papers? You really need someone in the news organization there who like is somehow connected to you. You can't just like throw in your pitch or throw in your story.
Sure.
Because we receive so many emails, yeah.
Sure. So I think you have to sit there and you have to do your networking and figure out, this professor of mine knows an editor at the Atlantic, or knows someone at the Daily Beast, or knows whatever. You pick and wherever, the Huffington Post, and they say, yes, and they introduce you, and then you're sitting there and something will happen, some event will happen, that you'll see a story, and then you'll write it up and say, hey, it was good to meet you. I have this story. Are you interested? And that's how you do it. And you, through work and over years, will create your network of people. I've always called myself a little bit, I consider myself a novelist. That's actually, if you ask me, that's what I view myself as. I'm always sort of an accidental journalist, and that I found myself in places where I'm like, whoa, this just happened. I really should probably write 1,000 words on that. It was pretty interesting, and I happened to be there and see it. And so I think that's what you sort of have to do, and you will build out a body of work and a body of contacts. You'll do it more quickly than you think if you set your mind to doing it. And then you reach your critical mass, and it becomes easier.
Oh no, I basically just had a comment. Like, Elliot said that he's listening to the book about Civil War, and yes, Pakistan's history is just 70 years old, but the history of, South Asia and the subcontinent is so long. And just like, the British, the American Civil War was happening like 200 years ago, we were, slowly being solidified as a nation under colonial rule. So for Pakistanis, I think at this point in time, it is really interesting because we have been taught history in a very different manner. It's very glossed over, it's very controlled, the narrative that is provided to us. But I think like these young students from GC and other young students over here as well, what they're doing is they're tracing their roots, and they're not just going back 70 years, they're going back 100 years or 150 years. And this whole narrative that has been built in Pakistan of a very Muslim nation and Muslim culture, Islamic culture, is being challenged now by the younger generation, which is a very exciting thing to be doing. And I think if we had something like 3,000 pages about our history, our multicultural history, that would be amazing for us.
You should write it. That's your anthropological book. That's your book coming out next. But I really
can write that.
Absolutely. No, but I really want to thank you for coming in with all your questions. Yes.
We have one final question after that.
Oh, you have one? Okay, I'm sorry. One final question, then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, I have to ask Elliot about the fact that we have seen in so many TV shows and books that war changes you forever, and going to such operations in areas like Iraq or Afghanistan changes you forever. So have you ever felt that post-war trauma, and if yes, then how has it affected your work or your art?
So I was trying to understand the question is, how has you've seen shows about the post-war trauma and how has it affected my art? I don't know. I mean, it's a theme that's made its way into my work at times, but I don't know that it's necessarily been a central thing because I've more focused on the events. But I think the fact that these wars have gone on so long is a theme that has definitely found its way into into some of my journalism and some of my books, and I talk about the unique nature of these wars, both from an American point of view and and from the point of view of what it's like to experience them when you're in the region where they are occurring. And I think these wars have been unique in how long they've gone on.
And I think for the whole team, both for Citizens Archive and I think for our audience as well, both in Karachi and Lahore, I think we have been so privileged to have both of you. I think the lens that you bring, I think your experiences, but even more than that, and why I also consider myself so lucky to have you as a friend and friends to Pakistan really is the sheer connection. You've used the word empathy, but simply your love for people and your openness to understanding. And I'm so grateful that we got to hear you and hear your perspective. And I was telling them that they must come and visit us in Pakistan. I think that's the logical next step. But all of us, we're so deeply grateful.
Thank you.
We're so deeply grateful. So thank you.
I think on our end, we would like to thank you for taking time out. I know it's quite early for you this. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.